Hello A-level students, and welcome to this lesson, which is going to examine grammatical perspective and tense in The Handmaid's Tale. This is part of a series of lessons looking at how the narrative is constructed in Handmaids. So we can ask ourselves, how is this narrative perspective constructed? Well, there's a quote there: "My name is Offred now, and here is where I live." Quite clearly, The Handmaid's Tale is written in the first person, or predominantly in the first person. But that's a very simplistic and straightforward way, and there's a lot of nuance and subtlety and flexibility within the novel that helps to create the narrative. It's not just good enough to say it's a first-person narrative, which means that we know that Offred's speaking and it's her perspective. We can look instead much deeper at the way that this perspective is constructed. We can do that by looking at the grammatical perspective, so the relationships between actors or agents or characters within the novel. We can look at how grammatical tense helps to establish perspective in terms of the time frame for action, and we can also look at how grammatical aspect conveys whether these actions are ongoing and completed, and this lesson is going to focus on those three things. So let's think more broadly about grammatical perspective, because there is more to it than saying the first person, the second person and the third person, although obviously that is a starting point. We have a distinction between subject pronouns and object pronouns. Within sentences, we know that grammatically a person can be the subject of a sentence, i.e. performing the action, or they can be the object of the sentence, or more precisely the object of the verb they're being acted upon. And that's the difference between I and me. Or the difference, for example, between we and us. And that does make a difference in the text, as you can see in those quotes there, because it makes a difference as to who's being foregrounded in the sentence. We also can think about how possessive pronouns are used in the text, and this possessive perspective to show ownership, and that's used very significantly when Offred talks about her room and her refusal to call it my room, which she later then does. We can also think of reflexive pronouns such as myself, yourself, herself, where the action is performed upon the self. So in this case, reflexive pronouns are used where the self is both the subject and the object of the sentence, acting upon the self. And we could also think about the inclusive use of pronouns. So these create a sense of inclusion, a sense of togetherness, and they are also used meaningfully. So it's worth at this point pressing pause, looking at a chapter or an extended section of the text, and exploring how different grammatical perspectives are used. Obviously the first, second and third person, as you know, will be used, but how are these represented as subjects or objects within sentences? Is there any use of possessive, reflexive or inclusive forms, and how can we link that to specific meanings in the text? The next aspect of grammatical perspective that we can look at is the use of the second person, you. The second person is obviously used within the text to represent direct speech, so where a character is speaking to another. We will look at different representations of speech in a later lesson, but where one character is speaking to another, obviously they address them as you. But direct address is also used more flexibly or in different ways elsewhere in the text. So, for example, Offred uses a second person to generalize experiences as we do. Things can change so quickly, buildings can be torn down or turned into something else. It's hard to keep them straight in your mind the way they used to be. So here, from this example from chapter 27, Offred is talking about her own experience, but by using the second person, it has the effect of generalizing that experience. Perhaps this is a way of her trying to express how her experiences are like those that other people would have. Elsewhere, the second person is used as a form of direct address, and particularly for different reasons, really. If we look at that extract from that small quote from chapter 30, I feel very unreal talking to you like this. I feel as if I'm talking to a wall. Chapter 30 contains a prayer which is framed in the second person, using the second person perspective, in which that second person is used for Offred's narrative to address God. Offred also addresses the reader or listener in the second person on a few occasions in chapter 41 and also in chapter 7, where she chooses to speak directly to the listener, in some way sort of breaking the fourth wall of the text by acknowledging that it's actually addressed to an unidentified listener or reader. And it has the effect of, as we read it, feeling that we are being directly addressed. That isn't always the case with other examples. For example, when we read the prayer, we know that she's actually using you to speak to God, but occasionally she speaks directly to us. She also uses the second person to address other characters when they aren't necessarily there to respond, as a form of almost rhetorically addressing. She addresses the idea of her mother here in chapter 21. You wanted a woman's culture, well, now there is one. So here, yes, I would say this is sort of a rhetorical usage of the second person. Similarly there, the same is true of her address to Luke here. To Luke, what I want to ask you now, she says. Obviously, she isn't speaking directly to him. He's lost her at this point in the novel in chapter 28. So it shows that the second person can be used quite flexibly within the text to perhaps accentuate her sense of loss or a sense of isolation, and to show how relationships with other characters are preserved in her private imagination. And there's a sort of an irony to these uses, in that she, I suppose, is having conversations or addressing people who can't respond. It's quite sad, but it has the effect of accentuating her sense of isolation and solitude, in that she's imagining, I suppose, conversations with loved ones, or that she can be heard by someone listening to her. Now we move on to tense and aspect, and think about the way that grammar is used to create perspective within a particular time. And there's a table there that you may have seen before, which shows the past, the present, and the future. And we know, obviously, that Offred's narrative will change tense as her narration moves between the past and the present, and also on occasion using the future tense, although the majority of the narration is in the past and the present. But we should also think about the way that aspect is used. Which aspect will tell us whether an action was, is, or will be ongoing or completed. So I've included in that table the use of the continuous and the perfect tense. The continuous tense shows us actions in the past or present that are ongoing, or that were ongoing, and the perfect shows us actions that are completed. And there's a note in the box there about how that's formed. They're formed with the use of auxiliary verbs. So continuous takes the auxiliary verb to be, and the present form of the verb with ing on the end. And the perfect aspect is formed using the auxiliary helping verb to have and the present form of the verb. So pause the video at this point, have a look at these examples from the text. There are 8 examples there. I've highlighted the actual the verb forms in bold. I've foregrounded them in bold for you to look at. Using your knowledge of tense and aspect, are you able to identify the forms used in those 8 examples? And can you add some explanation, knowing the context of the quote, as to how it presents the action that's being described? Is it giving it this continuous or live feel? Does it make it feel more present, or does it make it feel more static, as in examples of the perfect aspect? Pause the video, see if you can identify the verb forms used in those 8 examples. Okay, so those there are the answers, and that hopefully you will have been able to identify. If you haven't, or if you made any errors with those, then perhaps go back and check them. So in summary then, we can say that grammatical perspective has different functions within the text, and we can go beyond simply making simple comments about the first person being used to present Offred's perspective. And we can talk about the way that the second person is used to represent what we would call imagined discourse in Offred's narrative. We can also consider the way that aspect is used to control the reader's perception of not only when events are taking place, but whether they are ongoing or completed, or whether they were ongoing or completed at the time of the action. Okay, I hope that's been useful for you. Make sure that you keep your notes updated, and good luck with your